Welcome, everyone. My name is Anjali Goswami. I'm the president of the Linnean Society, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight for this absolutely fascinating discussion that we'll be having in partnership with the Systematic Association. Now, for those of you who don't know about the Linnean Society, it is the world's oldest active biological society, and it was founded in 1788 for the purpose of to support the study of and dissemination of information about the natural world. And in the past few centuries since its founding, this society has been the site of, I would argue, the most important discoveries in the study of the natural world. As you can see over here, Darwin and Wallace co-presented the theory of evolution by natural selection at this meeting room. And so for an evolutionary biologist like myself, this is very much sacred ground. And so it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you as we talk about looking forward into the study of the natural world and its relevance to some of the major challenges facing the planet. Now, the Linnean Society is a very broad tent. A lot of people think about it mainly as a place for scientists, but in fact, our membership is global and it involves people from all different sectors who share our vision of a world where nature is valued, understood, and protected. Now, that sounds like a great vision, but I think we can all agree it's much easier said than done. And that's why I'm very happy that we're having this really difficult discussion today to look at how we can all join forces to really fulfill that vision. Now, I will hand over to the president of the Systematic Association to introduce the speakers for tonight. So please let me welcome Dr. Pablo Munoz Rodriguez.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anjali. It's been very nice introduction. I will be very quick to give the floor to our guest speakers today. I'm Pablo. I'm the president of the Systematic Association. We are not as old as the Linnean Society, I'm afraid. We're still fairly old, 85 years old or so association. I try to promote and promote science and promote research that covers all aspects of evolution, from taxonomy to systematics to ecology. We know we have a mixed audience today. We're normally focused on scientific events, but it's very good for us to have other events as well, but in particular this event in joint organization with the Linnean Society. Because obviously the Linnean Society is a global society, so we are very fortunate to do that. But today, we are trying to bring together two worlds that are in principle very far away, far apart from each other, as it is biodiversity and finances. I won't introduce the speakers because our moderator will do it, but I really hope you enjoy it. The networking session afterwards upstairs in the library will also be very important. This event, the Science Policy Lecture, has been going on for a few years now, and this is the first time we do it as a conversation more than a general lecture. And with that conversation, we want to encourage networking between you and with the speakers, so please make the most of it. I don't want to finish before saying thank you to Padma as well for organizing, Padma from the Linnean Society for organizing and coordinating the event. And thank you all again for coming. And now, Lucy
Lucy Fitzgeorge-Parker.
Fitzgeorge, sorry. I knew it would be very difficult, sorry. I'll just.
Thank you, Pablo. Yes, my name is Lucy Fitzgeorge-Parker. I am the editor for Responsible Investor, which is a sustainable finance publication. And it's a great honour to be here in such a historic setting. And it's also quite an unusual setting for a financial journalist. But that is testimony to the level of interest there is at the moment in bringing together scientists and the financial sector to address the biodiversity crisis. To discuss this today, we're lucky enough to have with us two extremely distinguished speakers from the worlds of, respectively, science and finance, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. But first of all, just a couple of notes about this discussion. We obviously want to hear from Mike and Elree, but we also want to make sure that you as an audience have a chance to contribute, so we will leave 15 minutes for questions at the end of the session. And also, I realise that we have a possibly unique mixture of scientists and finance people in the room today, and that means we're all used to speaking very technical languages, but very different languages. And so Mike and Elree, I hope you won't mind if I do ask you to explain anything that I think might be a little bit tough for different parts of our audience. So yeah, that's enough from me for the moment. Mike and Elree, it would be great if you could introduce yourselves. Mike, maybe you could start.
I was going to ask Elree. Go on.
There you go. Good. Thank you again for actually coming. It's lovely to be doing these kinds of events in person again. And thank you, Padma, for all of the arrangements, and Lucy for sort of being the moderator. I'm honored to be here. So my name is Elree Winett Seelig. I'm the global head of ESG for our markets business at Citibank. For those of you who aren't familiar with what ESG stands for, it's one of the many acronyms that all of our sciences and the finance community sort of depend on. But it represents environmental, social, and governance. And it's a new trend, it's a new way that the financial community is looking at integrating what we call, as an economist, externalities. So it's things like pollution, labor rights, worker safety, emissions, and of course, biodiversity. And we use that, we call them pre-financial factors, and we're increasingly integrating them into the way we think about risk, in the way we think about pricing risk and deploying capital. I do want to say that although I work at Citi, some things I might say tonight are not necessarily the expressed opinions of Citi. So I'll just leave it at that.
Mike, you were also going to make a disclaimer, weren't you, as well?
You seem to do a lot of disclaimers in this business at the moment. My name's Mike Maunder. I'm from the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. It's a collaboration of 11 conservation organisations based at the University of Cambridge in the David Attenborough building. And I'm actually employed by the Judge Business School, so I'm a completely mixed up hybrid in many respects. Elree has for the last year been a Turner Fellow at the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which is set up by Trish Turner as a way of bringing different parts of the conservation and finance world together to discuss problems. And so there's been a continuous dialogue about what's possible. And tonight, I think, we'll reflect that. However, we both wanted to make it clear that whilst we represent our particular organisations, we're not speaking on behalf of those organisations, even though we might have been inspired by our brilliant colleagues at either Citibank or the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, and that there is no financial relationship between CCI and the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. So I hope that gives all the appropriate disclosures and I can go safely back to work tomorrow. Thank you.
And I should say, Elree, as well, just if you could, because you are not just speaking as a financial person, you do also have conservation credentials on your own account. So we'll just tell the audience very briefly about that.
Yeah, no, not relative to the people in this room, but I have hopefully spent, I sort of say that I've spent half of my life in conservation and half of my life in finance. And quite frankly, until this time in the finance community, and I think the conservation community, I haven't actually fit in either place. But what's been incredible over the last, say, 10 years is the level of upskilling and the level of recognition that we need one another, that we can't independently solve these problems without one another. So.
Fantastic. Well, so I guess the question is, we're bringing finance and scientists together. We're talking about the need to bring these two worlds together for biodiversity, protection, restoration. Why are we having this discussion now? Why is it important that we need to combine these two perspectives? Maybe, Mike, you could start us off with your thoughts on that.
Yes, I'm going to put a Linnean context on this since he's beaming down at us. So I trained as a botanist, and 1752 is one of the most important dates in my world calendar, the publication of Species Plantarum. I'm going to then jump to 1992, when the Convention on Biological Diversity was established, and then we'll go to 2022 and the upcoming COP. Linnaeus was at the birth of the great transformations that we are now dealing with. It's not as if kabang 1992, there was an environmental problem. We are looking at a long, slow-growing environmental crisis that's been going on for many centuries. And in the 1700s, Linnaeus was part of that European ruling class that were looking at the world as a set of financial ambitions. The sugarcane, the sugar islands were being transformed. The first wave of extinctions was happening in the Caribbean. At the same time, there had been levels of biodiversity that we couldn't even comprehend, looking back to the 1700s. But the pattern was there. The Industrial Revolution was turning, species extinctions were starting. The first sort of wave of African extinctions was coming up through South Africa with the extinction of the bluebuck, one of the first mammalian extinctions. Caribbean was going, Pacific was then undergoing the European influence. So he was sitting in this nexus where specimens were coming back to him for naming, for classification. And there's so many things we can trace back to that Linnean revolution. The world checklists for plants, the use of taxonomy, the interest in biological materials, natural capital for money. Linnaeus was fascinated about what crops he could take up to Lapland to make money for the Swedish government. And so that appreciation of natural capital and the value of nature was there, even if not labeled as biodiversity or indeed as nature. He had perhaps the ability to sleep better at night because he thought nature was immutable and would not change, and there was no possibility of extinctions. That's something that we don't have the benefit of. So 1992 is my other date, when in Rio, the Earth Summit was held and the Biodiversity Convention was launched. And to me, as a young conservationist working at Kew Gardens, this was one of the most important things I've ever participated in. And that structure attached to the Convention on Biological Diversity has grown and evolved to where we are now. And where we are now, well, we are now looking at a catastrophic decline in nature, in nature that underpins our activities, that underpins GDP, that underpins the profits of individual companies, and underpins the livability of large parts of the planet. And so it's this crisis that we're in, I think, has drawn together the finance community, the biodiversity community, in a recognition that we're all actually facing the same catastrophe. It's just, as Lucy said, there is a fog of vocabulary between us. And one of the things that I'm very keen to get around is this fog of vocabulary, because it means you can't actually get stuff moving unless you get through the vocabulary. So my final point is, the other week, WWF launched their State of the World report that talked about 70% decline in biodiversity since the 70s. That is actually a very false perspective. We're looking at a decline over the last 200 or 300 years, and in some species we might be saying they're only 60% of what they were in the 70s. They might only be 3% of where they are when Linnaeus was alive. So the catastrophe is far worse than some of our convenient statistics let us know. Thank you.
So,
Where do you go from there?
Clearly up to the present day. Well, but so clearly, you're on the finance side of this. So where is biodiversity coming into finance at the moment?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, obviously, we are living through the Anthropocene, massive, catastrophic losses of biodiversity. But Citi, I'm going to put it in a finance context. Citi did a really interesting report last year that basically said about $44 trillion worth of GDP is moderately or intensely linked to nature. Now, that puts it in a financial context. And I think where we are right now is a recognition that we have to do something, not just nature for nature's sake, but that interconnectivity that we have with the financial impacts of biodiversity loss, of ecosystem failure, of natural capital erosion. And I think what's really interesting is, and we've had this conversation before, 18 months ago, I would say maybe 10% of my conversations had the word biodiversity in them. Now, probably 60% of them do. And that's with the world's leading asset managers, asset owners, largest corporates, sovereigns, regulators. It's such a profound change that's happened There's a ton of issues that we have with this. This isn't easy, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of what's not easy about it. But what's super exciting is actually how we're all working together more. We're trying to address that language, and we're trying to figure out how we get money to conservation and establish those best practices to stop the further erosion.
Well, and I can certainly testify to that as well as a financial journalist. We talk to a broad range of fund managers, pension funds, insurers, banks, and biodiversity and nature are definitely the hot topic at the moment. Everyone wants to talk about it. I guess the problem everyone has is everyone looks at this and says, yes, this is a crisis. Yes, something needs to be done about it. Nobody's quite sure what, and particularly from a financial perspective. So, maybe just tell us a little bit about why it's such an issue, integrating that into the financial sector.
Yeah, I think what we've learned is we waited too long to address climate. We should have been having the conversations around climate 25 or 30 years ago. Quite frankly, as an economist, you would say externalities should have always been incorporated into pricing things. But at the very least, we waited too long. So people that are sitting in my kind of seat around Wall Street, around the city, we're starting to say we waited too long to address climate. Let's look out in the future. What are the next things? And certainly biodiversity is right there at the top. And we've learned a lot. We do not have climate sorted on any level, but the reality is just in 3 years, we've made massive progress. If you think about it, 80% of global GDP has made a net zero commitment. Now that's profound. That's going to change business models. It's going to change opportunity. It's going to change risk. And I think where we are is recognizing that we don't have it right, but we've made a lot of progress. And there's a lot of lessons that we've learned from that process that we have to start working on now in terms of biodiversity and natural capital.
I guess one of the things I think, Mike, you have some views on this is obviously there are lessons potentially from the way that finance and the community have dealt with climate. But also there is still the risk that climate does overshadow biodiversity. You mentioned COP just now. I assume you were talking about COP27, but of course there is another COP coming up shortly, which is the COP15 on biodiversity. Yes. So yes, is this? Do you think there is still a risk that climate gets, I'd say, too much attention, but perhaps that there's not enough balance between climate and biodiversity?
Well, there's several responses to that, Lucy. Firstly, at the Glasgow Climate COP, I'm going to put a name against each COP, because COP just means Conference of the Parties, and there are many different COPs. We've had 3 COPs relevant to biodiversity this year. We've had the forgotten, the hidden COP that looked at soil and desertification in Abidjan in the middle of the year, which is actually phenomenally important, looking at global soil resources. That received 0 press attention. It was one of the most important meetings of the year. We've got climate coming up in Egypt, and then we've got the delayed and much confused biodiversity COP. So they've created artificial taxonomies, if you like, to pay homage to our patron. And so there's an assumption that we can deal with these things through separate meetings. And one of the great things about the Glasgow Climate COP was the amount of biodiversity discussion. And for the first time, we got a sense that the barriers were breaking down. So there is a recognition that we're looking at a blended problem that includes climate, biodiversity, water, soil, and human health. And they're all mixed in and muddy and grubby. And one of my fears is that we will continue with this compartmentalized approach to dealing with these major global crises. And I fear that the climate COP has become, I heard a BBC reporter refer to it as the environmental COP. And I don't scream at the radio very often, but there was some venom let loose at that point. They're all environmental COPs, but the climate COP focuses on climate, and the biodiversity COP focuses on biodiversity. And they're intimately linked, but there are answers to the climate crisis which may not have an impact on our desire to save nature, and in fact could be incompatible with our ability to save nature. So we've got to have these conversations. And I'm afraid this is also something we're seeing in the newspapers, where there's even our blessed Guardian has a strong panel on climate, which includes biodiversity stories as well. So there's a lot of confusion in the public and media about this. But they've got to be tackled together, and we can't afford to focus on just one. If we sort out climate change over the next 50 to 100 years, we look back, we've lost 1 million species, and we've lost our ecosystem services. We're stuffed.
You know, but if I could build on that, I think what's really interesting, though, is coming from the financial community. I think what we've done is look at the success of the climate COPs and the alignment that we have, that 80%. I mean, that's quite profound. If we could get the level of awareness for individuals in the way they vote, the way they buy, the way they invest, to put pressure on the policymakers, on the corporates, on the financial institutions to address the biodiversity loss. I mean, it doesn't solve all the problems, but that awareness is really critical. And that's a great lesson for us to learn. I think the other thing that Climate COP has given us is a common target, 1.5 degrees, and a common metric, greenhouse gas emissions. The reality is we're lacking that in terms of biodiversity, and that's going to be really important because it gives us a North Star. I mean, we're dumb bankers. I mean, we actually like things to be the same. We at least need them to be comparable, to create liquidity, to create consistency, to create to be able to have sort of comparisons. So that metric and that target is also something that we've really learned from starting with COP15, basically. Yeah. I think it's really important. And I think what honestly we need is that push and pull from regulators as well. And the regulators have really grasped how climate has created potential systemic risk for the financial system. And we need that same thing to happen around biodiversity, natural capital ecosystems.
Okay, so I'll come back to the systemic risk in a moment, but just thinking about COP15 and the biodiversity COP, and certainly in the financial sector, from what I'm hearing, a lot of people at the moment are actually a lot more excited about the biodiversity COP than they are about COP27. I mean, we were hearing earlier this year that people were saying, oh yes, we're going to have loads of people going to Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27. Now everyone's saying, actually, you know what, maybe we're not bothering, or we're just sending a couple of people, but yes, we're sending our CEO to Montreal for COP15. But there's a lot of talk about maybe a Paris moment at COP15, and I think, again, as Elree's alluding to, finance would really like something nice and clear that they can. Is there actually much chance that they're going to get that from COP15?
Oh, no, yes. This is
crystal ball.
Yes, this is where I should be peering at chicken guts or something. We really need a Paris moment at the Biodiversity COP, and we really need the governments to create the frameworks that allow this to proceed. If we have strong government leadership, UK and global, because ultimately government sets the regulations in which a lot of this finance and a lot of this biodiversity monitoring and regulation will take place. So I'm optimistic, one has to be. Just looking at the amount of energy that people in my building have been putting into preparing for this COP for the last 2 years, and it's going to be the same at all the great biodiversity institutes in this country, whether it be the Natural History Museum or the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. We can't afford any more time because the extinctions are ramping up, and it's got real. I think the last 4 or 5 years has seen us realise that it has got real very quickly, and the level of erosion of natural capital just has to be dealt with now. So I think we learnt a lot from the climate COPs in terms of how to communicate. I think that's been a brilliant exercise by them, and bringing in the regulators. We just have an altogether more complicated thing to sell. We can't define biodiversity by the ton. And the prices for carbon at the moment are quite low, so it doesn't give us much leverage on using that for biodiversity at the moment.
Well, that obviously is the question. So we've got the COP15 and doing it a Paris moment more generally in terms of policy for biodiversity. And then there is the question of, do we get a metric that the financial sector can use? Elree referred to it as a North Star. Is it a North Star? Is it a Holy Grail? Is it a mirage? Is there actually going to be a single metric that the finance?
I've got one.
You've got one.
I've got one. We have a give or take an $84 billion gap between what we're spending on nature and what we need to spend on nature. So one of the crude things that could be achieved is actually setting up the finance for this to allow us to move forward and save nature now. I'm not sure if I give it 50-50, but releasing conservationists and conservation organisations to get on with the job and communities is a key part of what we want out of the biodiversity COP.
Back to finance again, and
Elree's going to find it for us.
Here's where it gets difficult, because there it is. Yes, as we say, we know we need the finance, but we don't have a single metric, and it's not it's not like climate. Greenhouse gases are global. Biodiversity is hyperlocal. How do people in finance start thinking about this?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because carbon emissions impact. There's basically a carbon budget for the planet. We don't have the same thing with biodiversity, but Mike and I have this conversation all the time. The reality is not all places are created equal, and not all activities have the same impact on biodiversity. We just need to get started. I mean, the reality is we know that there are 3 primary activities that are causing a lot of biodiversity loss. And we just need to get started. We need to focus on those key biodiversity areas, and we need to focus on those activities. It gets us started. It's imperfect, but we don't have time to wait. So, there's a few things. So we have 30 for 30. We will struggle as the financial community to make that relevant to how we act, how we invest, how we price risk, because it's really at a sovereign level rather than, it's even difficult at a municipal level to do that. So that's not an ideal sort of target for us. I think the bigger issue and I'm sure we'll talk about biodiversity data, we're in a world of superabundance of data. Our bigger problem is the attribution of responsibility. So as an investor, as a financial community, we have to be able to evidence why we are making certain decisions. The biodiversity data we'll get to in a moment, but it's that ability at that activity level that rolls up to a company, that rolls up probably to a holding company, or at least let's say a major corporate. It's understanding their role in that biodiversity loss. Is it the company's activities? Is it the community? Is it climate change? Is it sort of the sampling error? Like, is it just the normal variation of population? We struggle with that, but that's also where some of the most exciting partnerships that we're seeing evolve in this space is coming from.
I'll just point out that I think understanding supply chains and their impact on biodiversity is a crucial part of what we're going to see, and the disclosure of companies, not only their impact on biodiversity, but what they're doing about it, I think has huge potential to move the dial.
And I'm going to add a third metric that we're seeing a lot more work on. It's the impact on biodiversity, but it's also their dependencies on biodiversity and natural capital. Again, we go back to certain sectors that have an over-dependence on water, on all kinds of things. And that's where I think the financial community is trying to upskill, and we're being very targeted in terms of certain sectors, certain locations, and trying to create an engagement framework to be able to consistently put pressure on these firms.
Because obviously, as financial institutions, you do have a duty to your clients. It's not just a question of you have a fiduciary duty, and that is a legal duty. That is something that so that's where, when you're talking about evidencing causation rather than just correlation, that is where you really need the help from the scientists.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
But it's also where we struggle with the $84 billion. The reality is we are for-profit organizations, and there's a misalignment in many cases between who pays for the landscape scale restoration and to whom the benefits accrue. So that's frequently the local community, it's the government, it's future generations. It's not necessarily the company that has to set land aside or pay more money for a better dam construction. So there's several mismatches, but that's going to be one of the big ones.
Well, Mike mentioned disclosure, and reporting is part of understanding what the impacts are that corporates have on biodiversity and what dependencies they have on biodiversity. Maybe this is time to introduce the TNFD. Do you fancy explaining that?
Yeah, so the TNFD is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and it was modeled after the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. TCFD has had a profound impact on our markets. The integration of TCFD reporting into our regulatory framework was led by Mark Carney, and now 30 jurisdictions around the world are asking banks like Citi, insurers, asset managers, and others to start talking about and disclosing how we're integrating biodiversity, how we're measuring that potential loss, and even getting to the point of stress testing our loan portfolios and our trading books. TNFD is a little bit further behind, but taking a lot of the lessons learned. And
sorry, you were talking about climate, you said biodiversity.
That was climate. Biodiversity is further behind, but accelerating quite rapidly in terms of creating the framework for that disclosure. I'm concerned that, part of the pull for the financial community to think about transition risk and physical risk for climate is TCFD reporting and that recognition that it's potentially systemic risk. What we're not seeing is the pull from regulators to recognize biodiversity loss as systemic risk and therefore push TNFD reporting. So imperfect, work in progress, but it's that framework, that taxonomy that we need.
I would agree. I think the disclosures on biodiversity will be hugely important, and we have the tools to do that. So there are now increasingly good tools for tracking products, and we also can almost down to a pixel sort of look at landscapes and how they're changing in close to real time. So it's going to be less easy to get away with damaging supply chains than it has been up till now. I think the example that really took me by surprise, various groups have signed up not to purchase beef from forest land that's been felled in the Amazon. Well, we know that the number of cows slaughtered and processed by those companies far exceeds the capacity of those landscapes to produce that number of cattle. So they're being moved in from forested landscapes and then finished off in the cattle yards of Brazil. And so it's getting that local supervision and legal framework that means something established that's going to be key to this. Otherwise, we're going to create some very nice tools, but they won't deliver on the ground. And I think that's something that we all share, is making sure this really does happen and has teeth and is not just a paper exercise. And that's something Elree and I have talked about, that this has to result in change in behaviour, and government, whether it's at city, state or county level, taking it seriously.
Yeah, I think that's one of the frustrations that we probably all have in this room, is the reality, and I'm definitely not speaking for Citi right now, is that, to me, governments have outsourced biodiversity protection to the NGOs, to the scientists, and to the private sector, and that can't continue. We need better enforcement of the existing regulations, we need stronger regulations, and we need policy to support these changes.
Okay, so one of the things that we have been discussing is the data question, and going back to that and the question of whether that is, when it is a question of what the financial sector can do, whether they have the data that they need. And one of the things that we keep hearing from, again, from asset managers, from insurers, from pension funds is, oh, we'd love to do this, but we don't have, the data for biodiversity isn't good enough yet. Now, I know, Mike, you said you think that's nonsense, and
I'm not sure I said nonsense, but anyway. I think we have enough data to get on and start moving. We will never have complete data sets. And where we are now is incomparable to where we were 20 years ago in terms of understanding biological diversity, its distribution, and its conservation status. There are big holes. If we look at the IUCN Red List, the world's most comprehensive and credible listing of species extinctions and species extinction likelihoods, we've got the mammals, we've got the birds, we've got the reptiles, we've got a good chunk of plants. Q will argue we haven't done enough. I thought you would. But we haven't done any fungi, really. There's been a tiny number of fungi red listed. And we still don't understand the diversity of soils. But I think we cannot wait and use the argument that we don't have enough data. We have to get on with it. We've now got a process called the Key Biodiversity Area Process, which is identifying, if you like, the planetary crown jewels. That is working. Only one country has taken it through from initiation to fruition, and that's Mozambique. So there's a lot to do there. But I think we cannot, as professionals, defer decisions any longer. We've got a good chunk, we've got buckets of data, and we can do pretty good assessments with it. And it can be honed with time.
I totally agree. I mean, we've run workshops at CCI and we spend a lot of time looking at biodiversity data. We have a superabundance of data. The reality is the data sets don't always speak to one another, and what we don't have is the good mapping at the activity level back up to the corporate. Those are all solvable problems. We also live in a world where we're always pricing risks. And what do banks do? We warehouse risk, we price risk, we recycle risk. I mean, we're in the risk business. It's a probability business. So if we have 70% probability of the knowledge of further biodiversity loss, if that activity continues in that location, that should be enough information to get us started. So I absolutely think that we have good enough data to at least start engagement, but probably make better decisions. I do think that we have that issue about attribution of responsibility. I mean, I don't think it's as simple as saying there's a mine there, because is it the local community? Is it climate change? There's all kinds of reasons, and that's where we have a little bit of a difficulty. But what we've discovered as we've been working as an institution to integrate biodiversity and integrate some of these ideas is it's that forward looking. It's being able to play forward what that looks like, because we're pricing the future. And that's some of the most interesting discussions that we've had with the CCI community and with Mike about how do we actually leverage the knowledge. We're never going to be able to have all of the experts on staff. How do we not co-opt you, but how do we work with you to help us understand that forward-looking scenario?
With scientific credibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And look where we are. I mean, that's one thing that we lean very heavily on the science community. In some ways, we're very similar. I mean, we are super users of data. We have frameworks that we use for reporting things. For us, it's accounting standards. And what we haven't had is actually the climate framework or a green framework, and we haven't had biodiversity, those taxonomies, but being very science-based. And I think you'll see that the financial community is leaning very heavily on the scientists for that.
So we're still talking quite theoretically at the moment, and we're also talking, we've been talking about risk and the financial sector and risk, and clearly there is the question of the extent to which companies depend on biodiversity and to which they can damage biodiversity. There are also, if you look at the climate analogy, then there are opportunities, and everyone has been investing in climate solutions. So with climate, you have the risk. You have physical risk, which is obviously the actual risk from physical events, and you have transition risk, which is the risk from regulation. I mean, but also that you have opportunities. So with biodiversity, in practical terms, what does this start to look like? Where are the how do financial institutions look at this and say, okay, if we know the risk is here, what do we do about it? Do we come up with specific instruments? Do we, invest in some companies, not invest in others? Do we find that there are opportunities as there are with climate? Where are people looking at the moment?
So I think it's all over the place, but I think that we start with making decisions not to go into a certain area. And that actually started sort of 20, 25 years ago with the Equator Principles. But the reality is we choose not to do certain activities. We engage with firms to better the practices about how something is done, set aside land, reshape things. But I think what's really exciting, to me, I don't see so climate only sort of 12 months ago moved from just being about risk to being about opportunity. As we started realizing there's $2.7 trillion that needs to be invested each year to support transition, that means there are going to be winners and losers, back the winners. We haven't gotten to that point with biodiversity, but I think what's happened slightly differently is that we're looking to the financial instruments that we have and figuring out how we can change them, how we can adapt them by changing the collateral, by changing the payoff, by changing the wrapper. And we use those instruments to get money to conservation. And that's some of the most exciting things that's happening in the market right now. And that's where there's an incredible amount of work that the NGO community is doing with the financial community.
No. And some of that work is quite surprising, and it has taken me a bit by surprise. So earlier this year, at the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, we're working with UNESCO on plans for large-scale restoration in the Middle East. And we had a workshop on why do you want to restore the Middle East? What does landscape restoration mean there? And the city of Amman, Jordan, the capital city of Jordan, was represented at these talks. And they're saying, well, we've got a huge biodiversity risk, and we need to invest in restoration over the next 50 to 100 years to combat that risk. But we found out that basically Amman, Jordan, like so many cities around the world, floods. And it loses between 5, 10 or 15 business days a year to the city flooding, and there'll be no electricity, no transport, and the business community grinds to a halt. So they've come together and said the restoration of the watershed around Amman, Jordan is the thing we've got to do. It's a risk caused by overgrazing and forest clearance, and restoration is needed to allow the business community to proceed in Amman, Jordan. And so those are conversations we're having, many of us in the conservation world, where we're linking things like the transition from perennial grasslands to annual grasslands, and the link to sandstorms and the link to eye infections in the Middle East. So these are real economic benefits that could be served through conserving or restoring biodiversity and underpin the viability of business. So there's a very different set of conversations happening that I don't remember 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that what we've been doing is taking some of those conversations and, quite frankly, turning them into products, turning them into investment strategies. And it's anything from we're at a time where the financial markets are really struggling, and certainly emerging market debt is really struggling. And so how do we use the outstanding debt to give debt relief, but also to embed investment in mangroves, investment in education into the restructuring? So things like debt for nature swaps. But it's also using the financial instruments. We've done a lot of work together on looking at how we take bond instruments, adapting green bonds, turning them into biodiversity-linked bonds to restore protected areas, to do, and even at the corporate level, to do landscape scale restoration because of coffee plantations, and for coffee, for cocoa. There's just a lot of work happening. And of course, one of my favorite topics is how do we get even more money at a project level, and that's something that we can do through carbon offsets, not without its issues. And that's in fact how I met the CCI community, is how do we get the highest standard in terms of carbon offsets, not just in terms of the verification of those offsets, but the money actually going to local communities, the money going to biodiversity. And it's incredible the power that the financial community and the numbers, and that's actually one of the biggest issues that we have. We talk in sort of tens of millions.
Just to point out, one of my first conversations with Elree, I said, yeah, we got this project we'd like to do. And she said, we don't even get out of bed for
I didn't say that. That's the way he tells the story. It's like an old married couple. I would never say that. Yeah,
anyway,
at least
we're
not
told
then.
we're not thinking big enough.
Yeah.
No, it is. It's a question. Most conservation projects are a lot of in the millions if you're lucky, and
Yeah.
most for certainly for institutional investors, for pension funds, it's a sort of a 450 million ticket minimum,
Yeah.
100 million.
Yeah.
That is just an order of magnitude that is.
And what we've been trying to do is figure out either how do we work together, bring the NGO communities who are active in that area, or how do we break it into projects. So we have a lot of ways to address the constraints that the financial community might have in terms of they can't have too much exposure to a certain project. They can't be 100% of the project. They need to be 20% of the project. But finding 5 people that want to do the same project is a problem. So we've identified a series of projects and financial instruments, and we've just been basically saying, okay, what are all the problems? And we've been working with the investment community. And I would have to say, and we had a great conversation yesterday with one of the world's leading insurance companies. Just address the problem, just deconstruct the problem, come up with the solutions, and just do it. Like one proof of concept.
What was, I think, particularly interesting to me from this is I get very worried that we're initiating projects and doing conservation on 3 to 5 year contract lengths. And we're actually embarking on a 50 to 100 to 150 year adventure, an intergenerational commitment to keep nature alive and to rebuild it. Pension fund managers get that.
Yeah.
And it was quite a relief to hear them talk about, be comfortable with these long lengths of investment, which are a number of other parts of the industry are not comfortable with these long lead-in times.
That is very important, isn't it? I mean, the financial industry is not homogenous, and investors are not
Absolutely,
homogenous.
yeah.
There
Yes.
is a huge differentiation in terms of the length of investment, in terms of their risk, their appetite for risk, which obviously then has to be matched.
It's no more homogenous than the conservation community.
Another similarity.
Yeah.
I will just mention, I want to get on to the questions, but one other thing in terms of the financial instruments, we have seen this, I just mentioned as we've seen it this week, Uruguay raised money. They sold a government bond that had in the financial lingo there, it was a sustainability-linked bond, which means it has some key performance indicators that they have to meet or they have to pay extra, or in this case, actually, I think they get a discount if they meet them. And for the first time, this actually had one of the 2 key performance indicators was biodiversity, was protection of native forest. And that is quite a big step because up until now, I think there have only been sort of 4 or 5 bonds of any sort that have had a biodiversity component, compared with hundreds of thousands for climate. So that is a really interesting development.
It's a real step change, and I think it's a small amount of money for Uruguay, but the reality is it's a visible commitment that they make to protect those forests, and you have the financial community, that level, another oversight level. So it's as much headlines management, but there's a transparency and a commitment that they make. So hopefully we'll be able to scale more of those.
And I think you're talking in veiled terms about the rhino bond.
Yeah, so the rhino bond, and I think Alex is in the room. So the rhino bond is a bond that Credit Suisse and Citi co-led. And basically the key performance indicator were more rhinos in 2 parks in South Africa. The innovation that happened with that bond was as much the fact that for the first time, the payoff, the yield that an investor gets for holding that bond was linked to the success of the project. So for the first time, the investor was taking project risk, and that had never happened before. I have to say, it was really difficult to place. It's idiosyncratic. There's all kinds of issues with it, but that's a real change in the way investors are looking at these projects. And quite frankly, this is a horrible thing to say, but it's skin in the game.
Yeah. I think this pay for success model is something we need to look at. The other thing is that there is an external assessor of what success means for this project. So the Zoological Society of London, I think, is reviewing it to see whether it really does work. So the need for those scientific institutions is built in there.
And it goes back to, we have to lean on the science community, and that's where we also have to work together to make sure that they're rational. I mean, we don't know whether it should be 11 rhinos or 40 rhinos. And so working quite closely to structure this so that it can be successful was as critical, but also that it has the veracity.
And you can weigh them by the ton, like carbon.
I'm not going to go there.
Okay, well, I have lots of other things I would like to ask Elree and Mike at the moment, but I did say we'd go to some questions, so I'll open it up to the audience. If you could just, if you have a question, just briefly say your name and where you're from before you ask.
Sorry. And Johnny had
Jamal Ramshoy, I'm a PhD student at King's College. How does net gain, do you think, fit in, if you're familiar with the term? How does that fit into sort of a landscape scale, spatial resolution to biodiversity loss?
So this is biodiversity net gain. Yeah, we've got to do it. There's the curve, you know, we talk about bending the curve, where we look at the loss of nature and our ability now to turn that curve up by rebuilding nature. So restoration of biodiversity as measured by species, but also restoration as measured by soil carbon, soil quality, watersheds is absolutely vital to the next 50 years. And that's where you get into rebuilding the ecosystem services that business is looking for and rebuilding the habitats that support the biodiversity that we cherish, that we love. So it's an absolutely key component of our future.
I think we have some questions on this side as well. Oh, several. Pardon me, you pick one.
Forgive my perhaps ignorance on like basically how finance works, but how do you create an investment product for a conservation project? Because in my mind, conservation projects are often money sinks, like they don't yield any direct financial returns. So how does an investor get money back out of that?
It's been one of the biggest issues, why we have a problem with the $84 billion. So one of the ideas that we have, and some of the transactions we're doing, is basically an investor underwrites a project that has biodiversity and probably community co-benefits, but it also has carbon benefits, so it could be some level of reforestation, indigenous forests, and an organization like City is the off-taker, or we provide a guaranteed floor for the price of that carbon. And the investor is basically getting the yield from the carbon. So we basically we basically give a guarantee for that rate. We're really concerned, and we want very high standards in the carbon market. We're very concerned about, we want high standards, we'll just say that. I mean, one of the things that we want is we really want these projects to be successful, so we spend a lot of time not just looking at the integrity of the project itself, but looking at the waterfall. So we want to make sure that the government is satisfied, we want to make sure that the community is satisfied, that the project developer is satisfied. And so there's a lot of work that goes in around these, but essentially the first way that we're trying to monetize those projects is through carbon offsets and use that money to underwrite more projects. That's certainly what the NGO with whom we're working is doing.
And I would just add to that I think it's very interesting that in the sustainable finance community, I still meet a lot of people who are very committed to sustainability, who are very opposed to carbon offsets in any form. And that is understandable in the sense that there are still a lot of very low quality carbon offsets out there. But I think what I've heard from all the conservationists I've spoken to is that while offsetting it may not be what everyone would like to see, at the same time, this is literally the only way you're going to get funding that we need for nature, because these projects are simply not bankable on their own terms.
Unfortunately, I mean, we have to just get started. And quite frankly, we have to start underwriting these projects now. As imperfect as the carbon market might be, we try to make sure that they're the highest standards, that they're offsetting the right projects at the right, or the right sort of emissions at the right time. But for many of us, the important thing is that we're underwriting the project.
What about the other one at the front here?
Hello, my name is Alias Vardion. I'm a botanist at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And I would like to ask a question about forestry. Earlier this year, I paid a visit to the country Slovenia, where I was taken around by two forestry professors to show me how in Slovenia the exploitation of the natural forest, not planted plantations, but natural forest, has almost entirely shifted to a selective system by which trees are selected in the field, in the forest, for future cutting, whereas around them other trees are preserved. And of course, because if you cut them, you bring more light into the forest and the other trees can grow too. And I was told that this system, which is in Slovenia now in place for several decades, is actually more profitable than the large-scale clear-cutting, replacing it with plantation forestry. And I would like to ask the financial expert, is it not possible that financial institutions selectively fund such projects rather than the big clear-cut schemes that are still very common in the Northern Hemisphere at least?
Yeah, so and I love hearing about those projects, and I love hearing that the owners feel that they're successful, but also colleagues of ours at Cambridge who are actually measuring that carbon, that those projects are successful in terms of sequestering carbon. It's not surprising that they would end up being more profitable, first because there are lower input costs. I mean, if you think about the failure rate for managed forests, it's actually quite high. And then you also have, failure rate from the start, and all of the investment in fungicides and so on that are needed. I think there's a culture change that needs to happen. There's a generational change in the people doing the credit analysis. Those projects don't look like all of the other projects that the credit analysts, that the forest managers, that the investment officers have been traditionally investing in. But one of the interesting things that we're seeing is, there's obviously a handful of funds that are very focused on forestry projects and forestry investments. But in the search for yield that we see right now, we see a lot of what we call alternative asset managers. They invest in real estate and so on. They're widening that aperture to actually invest in forests, and they want those high quality forests because they're focused on adaptation, they're focused on climate. And so we see more and more money flowing into those kinds of projects, or the ones that have traditional forestry, but have buffer zones of circa 20 to 30% of indigenous forest all around that they keep intact. Imperfect, but there's certainly a lot more interest in those projects. And even the Finns, I was just in Helsinki, a month ago, and obviously forestry is really important in that part of the world. There are more and more discussions about how do they manage forests, but also, because that's, believe it or not, a just transition question as well in terms of the communities that are supported by those forests. So I think there's a lot more discussion than there was even 10 years ago, and there's a premium for those kinds of forests, even for the board feet from those forests.
Mike's come away from Brighton, can he ask a question?
Thank you very much. Hello, it's Mike Eames from WWF. We've got a finance team because we couldn't wait for governments to actually save the planet. So the question I've got, it's really interesting to hear all these positive stories about how money's going towards conservation. How do you get money to stop flowing from the people that are destroying the biodiversity?
And similarly, the perverse subsidies that are going and undermining conservation at the same time. Yeah.
That's actually one of my biggest concerns. I mean, anybody who spends any time with me knows that I've spent sort of the last 18 months of my life running around the world finding people who Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, who have made a net zero commitment, who will actually buy into a fund to support the early retirement of thermal coal. Because the reality is, through the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, they are busy getting those thermal coal generation assets off of the balance sheet of certain corporates, but into the hands of people that haven't made net zero commitments. And I'm super concerned about the same thing that's going to happen. We're putting pressure on some of the palm oil companies. We won't bank them. They can't get insurance. But there's still a demand. Those are yielding projects. Think about what tobacco is right now. Quite frankly, think about what coal is. That's one of my biggest concerns, is if there's a whole debate in my world about divest or engage, and I think most of us have learned that engagement is really critical.
So engagement is actually just continuing to not selling out, but continuing to remain a shareholder and keep talking to the companies.
Yeah, but I think it starts with that idea of it starts with us, how we buy, how we vote. Are we voting for people who are going to enforce regulations, create higher regulations, how we buy, and how we invest? I mean, think about our portfolios. Many people want the cheap and cheerful FTSE 100 tracker, but the reality is we know those firms that are in the FTSE 100.
Hi there, I'm Bente Klitgaard. I'm from the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And I have a question about, actually, I'd like to say there's another COP. There's another COP in November. There's the CITES COP. And that's the COP on illegal trade in plants and animals. Yes. And as a botanist, I'm involved in the CITES COP in terms of rosewoods. And rosewoods, as many of us will know, is that the amount of money being traded, the income from trading in rosewood exceeds the trade in pangolins and rhinos all put together. So I was wondering, how about it creating a rosewood bond?
Sounds interesting. I don't know how to finance it. It's really interesting. I would flag, this is a tangential comment.
I was inspired by your rhino bond.
Yeah. I don't know anything. I mean, I'm going to give a full disclosure. I don't know anything about rosewood. Like, is rosewood...
Slower breeders, unfortunately.
Yeah. I'll come back to you on the rosewood. Like, I have no idea, but let's give it a go. I mean, I don't know anything about rosewood. I don't know where to find rosewood. I don't know, like, what...
We do, but we need more money to, to protect it.
But I think what's really interesting, and I'm going to fly a city flag right now, is there's an organization called United for Wildlife, and it's through the Princess Trust. And City has been very involved with other banks in using, I mean, we spend a lot of our time on anti-money laundering and tracking money around the world. And we've basically turned an entire group within our organization just tracking the financial flows for the trade in illegal wildlife and illegal forest, like illegal products that are from the natural world. And I think that was like, it's super cool what they do, like tracking things around. And what they've been able to do, the whole group of them with Interpol and so on, is to create the evidence trail to be able to prosecute. And so although it's not the same as having a fund, I think the financial community is super engaged, and a lot of people don't know about it, but it's the work with traffic. I mean, one of the members of CCI, the work that we're doing together to bring our skills and our resources to tackling some of these issues.
Can I just add a point to that? I think this is where the rule of law that we discussed earlier is critical to a lot of these developments, because I think the rosewood trade has taken advantage of situations where the rule of law is not being looked at, and it's a bit of a bandit extractive industry. And so we've got to look at this ideal scenario, and we'll forever be chasing this ideal scenario of engagement and positive input from private finance, the role of philanthropists, the role of our biodiversity institutions, and importantly, the role of government in allowing us the working space to deliver what we need to do. And I think rosewood has been failed by a lot of legal systems, often in country, sadly.
One more question over here.
Thank you. Saoirse, I actually work in sustainable finance for a large European bank, but more on the engagement side, particularly with academia. And I did a lot of work with Cambridge actually back as a researcher. I'm really interested in if you think that it needs taxonomy for biodiversity to actually scale up the institutional capital. I think we've seen over the last few years the uptick being really driven by having clear definitions, and I wonder if that's something that's required, because I completely agree with you. I think the data's absolutely there. I think you speak to conservationists and it's been there for decades, but the translation of that data into something investable is something that's been quite difficult for people to understand, and I wonder if that's maybe a pathway ahead that you foresee in the next few years.
Should I have a go? Yes. Yeah. Yes, so one of the problems we face is we don't always provide the information in a palatable, understandable way, and we'll download 1,000 Latin binomials, and we'll talk about critically endangered, vulnerable. So we need a way of better translating that risk of extinction and the implications of that extinction. So I'm hoping that through disclosure processes, we'll know who's chopped down the last viable bit of that forest in country X. But we also need to provide the tools to the investors, and this is where I think systems like IBAT, where you can put in basically your latitude and longitude of where you want to develop a project, whether it's a tire factory or a cattle ranch, and it will tell you in quite simplistic terms, but very useful terms, how close you are to protected areas, what your impact will be, whether you're in the range of threatened species. And it's that translational communication that I think we're missing at the moment. But just to add to that, we're very worried about the viability of biodiversity institutions around the world. And this, whilst there is tons of data, it always needs curating. It can't be just mothballed as of today. And we also need those biodiversity institutions to turn out the tens of thousands of new graduates that we need to deliver restoration and to deliver on monitoring biodiversity impacts and to work in the hybrid zone between finance, law, and biodiversity. We are criminally underestimating the number of students we need to get out and train over the next 10 years, and that really does worry me.
I'm going to add something to that, because I've had 2 conversations with regulators in the last, let's say, 2 months, where they've said, don't hire any more of those graduates. We need them to go into the conservation community. Like, they're really worried about, they would love us to second people. They would love for us to do training with them. They would love for us to do joint ventures with them, but they do not want us cannibalizing the talent from those organizations. And so for the regulators to be aware of that, I think is really amazing.
Yeah, we're going to have a real squeeze on talent.
Hello, I'm Raquel. I'm Raquel. I'm from Brazil and work for Q Guidance since 2019. And since 2013, I was doing red listing and conservation. So first thing that I want to say, there is lots of young people or early career research. I was in my finishing the PhD when I started, but it's really hard to live, like jumping from project to project and trying to survive with those resources. Yeah. So this obligates many people that love working in conservation, don't have the opportunity to be in conservation and develop more. Yeah. And the other thing that I want to say is, I think like when I saw the title today, for today, I say, like making space for like a common planet. So, but when we think about finance, we see the finance world and the world. And I think something I would like to hear how we are going to think about the justice or change in law and everything for the entire world, because we see like from the talks here, like the private world is very protected and is very like, you have like the priority to be convinced to give some money to projects. But actually, when we think about the common disasters that's affecting everybody, we don't know, we say sorry, you know. So justice is now, I guess, and how we can change the justice and how we can actually make like a common planet with benefits to everybody.
Can I kick off? Yep.
Please.
Justice is a big deal. It's something that has clouded our discussions in that conservation is often done by small NGOs who perhaps, you look at the extraordinary community NGOs around the world that might be operating on an annual operating budget of $100,000 or $50,000, and they are doing extraordinary stuff. And at the same time, we've got the likes of Bezos releasing massive amounts of money. So we've got a problem of distribution, we've got a problem of access. And I haven't got an answer to that, but we have to sort it out because a lot of those small community NGOs are embedded in their society, embedded in their community, and can work so much more effectively than many large ones. So we need to find a way of opening access from a wider range of players to conservation finance. And I'm still getting over the shock of it, but I have heard bankers talking about the fact that GDP may not be the best way to measure society. So I think we're going to... there's going to be some changes, aren't there? Yeah.
There's a bunch of us working on that, and I absolutely hear you, and I also don't have the answer. I think one of the places that we're starting is trying to make sure that we come up with more blended finance tools. So the reality is, I mentioned, anybody that chooses a FTSE 100 tracker, the reality is we can't reallocate that money to a project in Gabon or in Brazil.
Just briefly, blended finance.
Blended finance, sorry. That's where we lean on the multilateral agencies to de-risk a project so that the investment capital can flow in. And there have been
big development banks.
Yes. Yeah, World Bank, IBRD, ADB, and others. But to Mike's point, some of the work that's happening right now, this is a really big year for the world of economics because the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and some of the banks are getting together to talk about what are the new measures of wealth and health of a nation that we need to consider. The reality is GDP is a dated model. It requires production, consumption, sales. But what we're ignoring is the innovation that happens in societies, the natural capital that underpins the success of societies. And so there's a lot of work being done to say, how do we start looking beyond GDP? It's a start.
And I think it's a very good place to finish. I see Anjali is wanting to... well, I just wanted to say thank you very much, I guess, to Mike and Elree for a fascinating discussion, as always, and thank you very much, all of you, for listening and for some really insightful questions. And thank you, Anjali, for inviting us.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for being an absolutely fascinating panel. As somebody who works on extinction in deep time, I often find the current crisis, I feel very despondent about it. This has actually been one of the most positive discussions, and I feel very hopeful for the future, knowing that people in finance are talking about this the majority of the time in their conversations now, as opposed to being the exception. And so I hope we see more of that going forwards, and please, I hope all of us can find ways to be involved with these efforts. So thank you for our absolutely fantastic panel. This is not an end to discussions. This is just moving to the next phase of discussions upstairs, where you can partake of wine in our beautiful library and hopefully continue these conversations. So thank you, everyone.